Hello. In this video lesson, we get a brief glimpse of economic modeling by considering a so-called gravity model of trade. So as a motivation, let's start by the following figures that I uploaded from the Statistics Finland database. So on this slide, on the left-hand side, I have depicted the share of Finland's imports in the first half of 2024. On the right-hand side, I have share of Finland's exports in the first half of 2024. So we have countries from smallest to largest, and we can see that both in terms of imports and exports, Sweden is the most important trade partner of Finland. If we consider the imports, then Sweden is followed by Germany, and then China and the USA, and then other European nations. If we consider exports, then Sweden is followed by the USA, then Germany, the Netherlands, and China is only in the fifth place, whereas it is third place in the imports. So this obviously reflects these kind of patterns of world trade, like I mentioned in the previous lesson. So remember that China is the world's largest exporter, and the USA is the largest importer in the world. So it's natural that also Finland is importing more from China and exporting to the USA. So this follows this kind of patterns of world trade. But then why, for example, Sweden is so highly ranking and Germany in this kind of Finland's latest trade statistics? So to address that one, it can be useful to consider the so-called gravity model of world trade. So the term gravity here comes from the physics. So of course, in physics, there are laws of gravity that govern, for example, orbits of planets and other objects. So traditionally, economics has been very much inspired by natural sciences and particularly physics. So compared to many other social sciences and business studies, in economics we like to use equations and sort of summarize our insights in mathematical formulas. So this gravity model of trade is a good example of how economists are thinking. So in this equation 2.1, which is taken from the Krugman et al. Textbook, on the left-hand side of the equation, we have the value of trade between countries I and J. So the subscripts I and J refer to the countries. For example, I could be Finland and J could be Sweden. And T is the value of trade. On the right-hand side of the equation, we have some constant term A, which is not so important. But more importantly, the gravity model states that the value of trade depends on the size of this home country and foreign country. So if you think of country I as a home country, so the gross domestic product, GDP, we can think of it as an indicator of the size of the economy in the home country. And YJ here, I think is a typo. YJ is country J's GDP. So this would be the foreign country's size in terms of the gross domestic product. So the larger the countries, the larger the trade between those countries. But there is also another factor, which is D, which refers to the distance between the two countries, I and J. So by distance, we can think about that as a distance in kilometers. But then of course there's also it depends on this kind of what kind of trade routes, how expensive, for example, shipping is, and so on. Perhaps also cultural distance can be of factor here. So this is not so exact as in physics, even though it's inspired by similar kind of thinking. So, but interestingly, also in the case of Finland, this kind of gravity model can help to explain some of the patterns. So remember that trade between countries depends on the size of the country, but so it's kind of proportionate to the size of the country, but inversely proportionate to the distance between the countries. So if we return back to this shares of Finland's imports and exports, it is not surprising that Sweden is the most important trade partner because Sweden, as a neighboring country, is close by, but also it's relatively a large economy compared to Estonia, for example, and larger than Norway, for example, which is also appearing on this list. Um, then, of course, we have this kind of, if you think about the size, then the largest exporter is China, and the largest importer is USA, like I mentioned. So these, it's not surprising that these are appearing high on the list, and it also falls to this gravity model that USA and China appear high on this list because of their size, even though the distance is large. And then, even though there's other large economies in the world, but the European nations appear relatively high on the list because of the distance argument. That, for example, Estonia is a relatively small country, but it's very close by. So share of Finland's exports to Estonia is higher than to Italy. Of course, Italy is much larger country, but further away than Estonia. So the gravity model can explain certain type of trade patterns like this Finland's example illustrates. Of course, it doesn't explain everything like the laws of physics. So let's take a counter example, and the most obvious one would be Russia, which is also a neighboring country of Finland and relatively large in size. Not as large as USA or China, but sort of similar to the Netherlands. But Netherlands appears as one of the Finland's top import and export partners, but Russia does not. And this, of course, relates to for example, economic sanctions. EU imposed sanctions to Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine, and then Russia has imposed counter sanctions. The border between Finland and Russia is currently closed. So this kind of other factors, political factors, also influence the patterns of trade, which the gravity model does not explicitly take into account. So implicitly, this would assume that there is free trade between the countries, but of course that's not really the case. There can be tariffs, and there can be other non-tariff barriers, or even economic sanctions. Another feature of this gravity model is that notice that this equation is totally symmetric between countries I and J. So the model would predict that the value of trade between Finland and Sweden is equal. So there cannot be such kind of trade deficit or surplus. So, for example, the gravity model cannot explain why China is exporting more than it imports, or why the USA is importing more than it exports. So this kind of asymmetries the model does not take into account. Let me conclude this lesson by then looking at or indicating another interesting trade pattern when considering Finland's imports and exports. So this data is similarly taken from Statistics Finland database. So these figures on the left-hand side we have quarterly imports, and on the right-hand side we have quarterly exports of Finland. And here in these slides, I have broken down these imports to two parts. The blue line represents imports of goods, so physical products, and orange line is imports of services. On the right-hand side, we have exports of services. And we can see that the imports and exports have fluctuated quite a bit over time. But particularly if you look at services, there is a clear growth trend. So both imports and exports are approximately doubled in the past 10 years time period. So that's a large proportionate growth in services. So there has been a lot of discussion about services outsourcing, but I believe that this kind of large growth of imports and exports of services is also related to the digitalization. So it is much easier to export digital services and import digital services than it used to be before. And the similar kind of growth in services trade is also observable in the case of other countries. So in the next lesson, then we will consider a little bit longer term perspective on globalization and how globalization has developed. It's not as straightforward trend as it might appear. So see you in the next video then. Bye bye.